Hey, this is Ron Coddington from Military Images Magazine. We're here with Season 3, Episode 3. And while we're waiting for folks to come on, I want to talk a little bit about last week's program. I'm not quite sure what technical difficulty we had, but you'll be pleased to know that I did an entire 30-minute program thinking that all of you were with me. The one thing I noticed that was a little odd was that there was no comments coming up on the side of the screen. I now see Liz Topping and Michael Pissarro, so that gives me some hope that we're actually broadcasting. There's Gene, thank you. So last week was quite fun. I had a suspicion something might be going on, but I didn't know for sure because the camera was telling me that I was recording live. So good to see Gene's note. That's great. Michael saying hello. So I'm confident that you are seeing me. So I'll start out tonight by talking a little bit about the poster, the postcard that you see here. This is our upcoming DC Antique Photo and Postcard Show. Very small in the right-hand corner, it says include Civil War photo room. That's us. We're the Civil War photo room, along with Doug York of Civil War Faces and the Civil War Photo Collectors Society. We have, I think it's up to 20 tables now, 18 to 20 different tables. It's a whole weekend. You can see Sunday, March 8th is the show, but the Saturday evening before that, we're having Civil War talks, Civil War photo talks. We have Diane Wagner of the National Gallery of Art talking about Civil War photography. Rachel Wetzel of the Library of Congress talking about how to preserve photographs and how to care for your collection. We're going to be hearing from Jim Quinlan of the Excelsior Brigade. He's going to be talking about the Arlington Cemetery project that he's involved in and more. So stay tuned to Facebook to get more details on all those events. Also on Friday, the 6th, we're going to be having a behind-the-scenes tour of the National Portrait Gallery, so you can see some of the amazing Civil War material. Now, as I mentioned, keep following our Facebook page. We're going to be providing more information. It's coming up soon, March 6th, 7th, and 8th. So if you are in the DC area or plan on visiting, now is a great time. So, happy President's Day. So here he is, Abraham Lincoln. In 1861, as you know, he's President of the United States. I'm doing a little bit of research to find out a little bit more. I became curious about presidents of that time period and how they're reacting to what's going on. And I found this news article in the March 27th, 1861 issue of a great newspaper. It's got a great name, out of Woodsfield, Ohio. It's called The Spirit of Democracy. And there's a little news brief here. It says a significant fact. And it mentions, actually, I'm going to ask this for you, a little bit of a quiz. When Lincoln became president in 1861, how many living presidents were there, not including Lincoln? Somebody want to take a guess? 2? 3? I'm looking for somebody maybe to give me an answer here. Not seeing it yet. I'll give you just one more second. How many think? All right. Spoiler alert, cover your ears if you don't want to hear this. 5 is the answer. There's 5 ex-presidents, which is pretty good. In fact, if you look back at the 19th and 20th centuries, you don't see many instances when you have that many presidents alive at one time. So this note in the Spirit of Democracy says, every one of these retired statesmen favors the plan of compromise known as the Crittenden Plan. Do you know it? Well, this is a last-ditch effort to unite the country and prevent a division, to prevent a war from happening. It says anyway, the Crittenden plan or something akin to it. While Mr. Lincoln, the Republican organs are right, if they're right, and his speeches may be taken as an indication of his policy, rejects all compromise and prefers force. Is his wisdom greater than the combined wisdom of his predecessors? Interesting stuff. So, who are those 5 ex-presidents who rallied around the Crittenden plan? Well, you know this guy, Martin Van Buren, old Kinderhook, okay. He's the 8th president of the United States, and he comes out in favor of a last-ditch effort to save the Union. The second oldest ex-president, our 10th president, is John Tyler. And John Tyler, in some ways, may be perhaps the most interesting of the ex-presidents that are alive at that time. As many of you know, he's a Virginian who winds up remaining loyal to his home state and winds up being a member of the Confederate Congress and dies in early 1862. He plays an important role in this peace convention in early 1861, and he makes a speech. And he pretty much says he actually makes this speech to the peace convention at Washington from the chair, and he makes a rather Victorian speech, which is my nice way of saying a rather long speech. But I do want to read you a little bit of it here. He says this. He says, "The country is in danger. It is enough. One must take the place assigned to him in the great work of reconciliation and adjustment." Now, this is his way of saying that he's embraced this position as head of the peace convention, and he's honored to have it. So he says, "The voice of Virginia has invited her co-states to meet her in council. In the initiation of this government, that same voice was heard and complied with, and the results of 70 odd years have fully attested the wisdom of the decisions then adopted." Now, he's talking about the Constitution. He's talking about the Revolutionary War. And he goes on to say, "Is the urgency of her call now less great than it was then? Our godlike fathers created, we have to preserve. They built up, through their wisdom and patriotism, monuments which have eternalized their names. You have before you, gentlemen, a task equally grand, equally sublime, quite as full of glory and immortality." He's talking again about this peace convention, this last-ditch effort to save the Union. "You," he's talking to his fellow delegates, "you have to snatch from ruin a great and glorious confederation to preserve the government and to renew and invigorate the Constitution. If you reach the height of this great occasion, your children's children will rise up and call you blessed. I confess myself ambitious of sharing in the glory of accomplishing this grand, magnificent result." He's super positive. "To have our names enrolled in the Capitol, to be repeated by future generations with grateful applause, this is an honor higher than the mountains, more enduring than monumental alabaster." He goes on. And of course, in the end, the peace convention comes to naught. And as I mentioned, he dies as a Confederate member of Congress and never sees the outcome of what happened to the Constitution. Our third oldest ex-living president, who knows this man? Millard Fillmore. He definitely throws his weight behind the Union and the Constitution. About a week after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, actually less than a week, there's a report in a newspaper talks about the speech he gave in his hometown, Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, I believe, is the 5th largest city in the country. It's huge and dominates in many, many industrial respects and otherwise. So I can imagine the throngs of Buffalo citizens who listened to this speech. I'll read just a little bit of it. This is Buffalo, April 16th, 1861. Fillmore says, "Civil war has been inaugurated and we must meet it. The government calls for aid and we must give it. Our institutions are in danger and we must defend them. It is time now to inquire by whose fault or folly this state of things has been produced." He's saying, let's forget about the past. We got a real problem here. Our institutions are in danger and we must defend them. It is no time now to inquire whose fault or folly the state of things has been produced. The ship of state is in the breakers, and the muttering thunders and darkened sky indicate the coming storm. And if she sink, we must go down with her. We have a common lot and must meet a common fate. Let every man, therefore, stand to his post, and like the Roman senator at the gate of Pompeii, let posterity, when the storm is over, find our skeleton and armor on the spot where duty required us to stand. As you know, Fillmore later becomes, I think, captain of a home guard, the Continentals, and he has a Continental-like uniform that he and his company wears. He goes on, "You know, my friends, that my love of country embraces the whole Union, and all that relates to the administration of the government. I know no North, no South. Each and every portion is alike entitled to its protection, and I have that confidence in the administration, the Lincoln administration, that is, to believe that it will receive it. I therefore think our Southern brethren have made a great mistake in arraying themselves against the government." And he goes on and on and on. That's Millard Fillmore. Now, the fourth ex-president, Franklin Pierce, Mexican War general. He makes a speech a few days after ex-President Fillmore in his home state of New Hampshire, Concord, New Hampshire, the bustling city, has throngs gathered to listen to their ex-president speak, and ex-President Pierce makes his speech, and at the end, he makes this comment. He says, "Be just to yourselves, just to others, true to your country, and may God, who has signally blessed our fathers, graciously interpose in this time of clouds and darkness." So Pierce is calling out to God for help. He continues to say, "And save both extremities of the country and cause the old flag to be upheld by all hands and all hearts." Then he says, "Born in the state of New Hampshire, I intend to and shall here repose my bones. I would not live in a state that right and honor of which I was not prepared to defend at all hazards and at the last extremity." So there you go, Franklin Pierce. Our last ex-president is James Buchanan. He just exited office, and he, of course, takes the blame for his role in letting the country decline even further during his last 4 years. I enjoyed reading these accounts from Tyler and Fillmore and Pierce, mainly because you don't often think of these men, these ex-presidents, as human beings that lived through this time. You think of them from past periods where the country was building towards a polarized country where you had the promise of great hope, but also the promise of great failure. And to be able to put some words to their faces seems appropriate on this President's Day. So now, I want to share something from a recent post on our Facebook page that got an interesting comment. This is Benjamin B Hart. Posted him, I think, last week, and you may have read the title of the post. It was First Class Scout. This image also ran in Military Images. A couple issues back, we did our special feature called Optics, which featured a handful of images of soldiers who had binoculars and telescopes, which as some of you know, are fairly rare. You don't quite see them very often in images. So when I saw this image here, this gentleman, he's definitely a private holding binoculars and a revolver. It certainly raises some questions. One of the folks who commented on this post is James Jacobson, and he said his comment is this: I also wonder if there was ever a time when pistol users would actually stick a pistol under the belt. I can see that holsters could get in the way. He's referring specifically to the fact that Hart's revolver is tucked into his belt. Now, those of you who are collectors will probably jump to a different conclusion, or at least consider an alternative explanation, which is that perhaps the revolver was a prop and he was just showing it off. The photographer gave it to him and he put it in his belt just to be able to show that he was a tough guy ready for battle. So the real answer to this question offers a different perspective. This photograph, by the way, has a photographer's back mark of Upton's Hill, which is on the edge of Arlington, Virginia, which in 1861 was more or less no man's land between the two armies. It's the edge of the Union Army defenses and their encampments. And so we have Hart posing for a photographer at this time, about this time. And there's a newspaper article from early 1862, which talks about Hart and explains why you see the binoculars and a revolver. I'm going to read just a little bit of it. He says, or the article says, at a dress parade a few evenings since, the regiment was formed in a hollow square and Private Hart was called forward. The major then complimented him on his soldierly bearing and courageous adventures. Those courageous adventures are his scouting. He was apparently involved in scouting missions, which probably didn't stray very far from camp to be able to peer into Falls Church and maybe go into that town, which was neighboring Arlington, to be able to find out what the Confederate Army was up to. By the way, you'll later see Professor Thaddeus Lowe with his balloon doing observations. So Private Hart is out there doing some scouting missions and is getting called forward. So he's on the field during a dress parade, and here Private Hart walks up to the major, and the major compliments him for his adventures in the name of his regiment, which I realize I have not mentioned yet. His regiment is the 24th New York Infantry. Now, the regiment, as a testimonial of their appreciation, the newspaper continues, presented Hart with a revolver of superior workmanship, a spyglass, pocket compass, and a set of maps of the region and state of Virginia. So, considering the fact that this presentation of the revolver and the spyglass and the maps occurred at Upton's Hill, and this photograph is taken at Upton's Hill, it's fairly a safe bet to say that this image is a moment where he is commemorating the honor that was bestowed upon him by the 24th New York Infantry. There's another grim fact that makes me very sure that this is the subject of this photograph, and that is, less than a year later, months later, at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Hart is in the action. He receives a wound in his right leg that ended in his amputation and eventual death. So he did not survive the year 1862. He has both of his legs here, and so it's fairly safe to assume that this is a photograph that commemorates his good work he did for his regiment and for the Union Army. So, got a little bit more time here, and I want to share with you some of the treasures that I scanned. Well, not my treasures, the treasures of other collectors at the recent Dalton show in Georgia. It's actually the Chickamauga show, and I was in Dalton. I love going down to Dalton. Some of you know that I lived in Atlanta for a while, so it's an easy trek to Dalton. Great show, and always some interesting images to come out of there. One of those images is there you go, from the Bobby McCoy collection, and we have appears to be a high-ranking Confederate officer who is resting one hand on a crutch. And in fact, it's pretty easy to find out about this gentleman. This is Alfred Jefferson Vaughan Jr. He's a Virginian, graduated from VMI in 1851, right about the middle of the pack. He's 15 of 29. He winds up in Mississippi, joins a company. They go to Tennessee, become part of the 13th Tennessee Infantry. He's promoted colonel. He's lightly wounded or slightly wounded in Shiloh. At Chickamauga, he's promoted from colonel, which was his rank in charge of the 13th, to brigadier general. And apparently, at least according to one source, he gets this promotion on the field of battle. He was present when Brigadier General Preston Smith was killed at Chickamauga. Vaughan went to his side, immediately took charge of the brigade, and received his brigadier star for that. Less than a year later, during the Atlanta campaign, it's a distinguished day, July 4th of 1864, Independence Day in the Union. Vaughan is leading his brigade during a skirmish at Vining Station, and an exploding artillery shell literally took off his leg, ending his military service and explaining how he came to pose with the crutch. Vaughan recovers from his wound, goes on to live a fairly long life, and he writes his book, his reminiscences. I believe this is in the 1890s, if I recall, personal record of the 13th Regiment, Tennessee Infantry, by its old commander. You can find this book if you do a search. It's on Google Books. You can check it out. I have to admit, I haven't actually looked inside of it yet, but I'm interested to know more about his life. And here is a post-war image of him. He is looking like the veteran Confederate officer that he was. So I want to share this image that came out of the Dalton show. Here's a Union soldier from the 2nd New York Mounted Infantry. What really caught my attention about this photo, I believe it's Andrew Ackerman, is the backdrop. Take a look at what's going on here. There is, I've honestly, I don't think I've ever seen this backdrop before. It has what appears to be a Capitol building. There's a river flowing around it. You've got a schooner in the foreground. You have a dry dock with a ship under construction. And when I put this on Facebook, Buck Zidell looked at it and he said, it looks like there's actually a painted floor, a floor drop. It looks like there's a painted, wooden painted floor that he's standing upon, which gives it like he's standing inside the painting. Anyway, since he's a New York soldier, my first thought was maybe this is Albany, New York. And I'm looking at the Capitol, I'm seeing the dome, and I'm thinking, okay, it must be a state capitol. So those of you who are from New York or know Albany are probably laughing right now because the Capitol building in Albany does not have a dome. So it cannot be Albany. And looking closer and studying it, I began to think, it looks like it could be sort of a crude painting of the Capitol Dome in Washington. It's anatomically correct, but slightly off. And so I posted on Facebook, and Brian Cheeseborough from the National Archives says, hey, what we're looking at here is the backdrop is actually inspired by this painting. And the artist is George Cook. He's a Marylander who was prominent throughout the southern states prior to the war. He also traveled extensively in Europe. He does this painting of St. Peter's Basilica, which I think is the largest framed canvas in the United States is something like 23 feet long, 17 feet high, resides at the University of Georgia right now. And Cook painted a scene of Washington, D.C., a view from the Navy Yard in 1833, which explains a couple of things here. It explains, and I'll go back, it explains why the dome is so crudely painted. Let me go back one more, actually. The dome is crudely painted because the dome didn't exist. And in Cook's 1833 painting, you have that original bell-shaped dome on the Capitol. So George, or the painter that did the backdrop, updated the dome. Now, the artist who painted the backdrop, I'm surprised. I don't know that he or she would ever have seen George Cook's painting. But that's okay, because the painting was reproduced in an engraving in 1834. And so it's my guess that the engraving made its way around the country, and the artist who painted the backdrop probably saw this engraving, thought it was a really neat view. And you're looking now at a copy of that engraving, and you're seeing the eastern branch, what's called the Eastern Branch, or was called the Eastern Branch. It's now the Anacostia River, which flows together with the Potomac River. Now, if I put these two side by side, Cook's original painting and a detail of the 2nd New York Mounted Infantry photo, you're going to see here's the commonality. The artist has taken some liberties for sure. There's a little bit of difference in the look, but unmistakably, you've got all the same imagery that's in here. So a little extra detail. Some folks are trying to help figure out who the photographer is who made this image, because there's no back mark on it. Kyle Stetz sent me this eBay posting, which I believe is now ended. At least it was live last week when I was doing the show that you didn't see. So interestingly enough, this soldier is posed with the same backdrop in a tintype. It's enclosed in an envelope, one of those CDV envelopes. And the back of the envelope has the name F.W. Oliver of Oswego, New York. Now, I'm pretty positive that it is not F.W. Oliver, because this envelope, and here's the front view and the back view, this envelope certainly has more of a feel of an 1870s quality to it, maybe late 1860s. It certainly doesn't have a Civil War quality to it. So I'm thinking that whoever had this archive of material basically took the tintype and put it in the envelope, probably believing that they belong together, or maybe just trying to keep it safe, or maybe just swapping it out because they like the paper envelope. Whatever reason, the author of the painting and the photographer who took it are currently unknown. I'm hoping that Adam Fleischer, who is working on our new column for Military Images called Behind the Backdrops, is going to be able to help solve this and other mysteries. So we have a couple more minutes, and I'll go quickly. We've got this image from the David Vaughan collection, a heck of a beard, an interesting mustache, almost a handlebar mustache. You can see his very tight, small buttons on his vest. And the back of the image says Mr. James, it looks like Mr. James H. Creed of White Plains, North Carolina. This is a mystery that's waiting to be solved. I could find several Creeds in North Carolina and a James H. Creed in Arkansas. So looking for a little help to try to figure that one out. And I'm going to close with one more image. Tom Lillenquist, who many of you know is behind the image collection that is at the Library of Congress, came over to the table and asked me if I would be interested in scanning this carte de visite of Edward Sorrell. Many of you probably don't know him. You should. He is a Union engineer who was involved in South Carolina along the coast. He's a brilliant guy. Among other things, after the war, he sketched out plans for airplanes. He's a real engineer ahead of his time. So Tom brought over a map that he drew, which I'm not going to put up here in the interest of time, but he had this photograph and he had this ribbon from a reunion in 1908 in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Now, Tom, I scan the button or the ribbon, and there's a button in the middle. I scan the photo, I scan the map. We say our goodbyes. Tom heads out, and I believe he was trying to catch a plane. About 10 minutes later, another image comes to the table, and Rick Brown comes by with it. And look at this. It's an albumin photo of guess who? Edward Sorel. And to my knowledge, it's an unpublished view, an albumin of Sorel. The CDV view is very often published. So I thought it was really amazing that within a space of 10 minutes at the Dalton show that these images would surface of maybe one of the best unknown engineers in the Union Army. As you know, we have many of these kinds of serendipitous moments that occur in the collecting field. And I'm sure that you and I both could go on for hours and talking about the experiences that we've had. However, we're beyond time at this moment. So I'm going to close for this evening. Check our Facebook page for information on the DC Photo Show. Keep collecting, happy hunting, and stay tuned for the next episode of Military Images Live. Good night.